Let me ask you, what responsibility in your mind does the US have to the rest of the world to sort out this mess around vaping?
Well, US first of all has the most number of vapers, right? So they have the biggest constituency. They've also seen accelerated decline in smoking. Teen smoking has vanished. So there is strong data to suggest that vaping is replacing smoking, and obviously we also know that vaping is less harmful. When you have that data, it is also, and you are a big funder to the WHO and just generally the whole UN system, and what US does or decides, or what the FDA says or C decides, is also something which is more readily accepted. But when it comes to tobacco control, US and even the UK are not stepping forward and taking leadership and saying, okay, THR worked in our countries and we would like others to also have an opportunity, which is not to say that policies should be same everywhere, because each country is in a different level where they have developed to, and they need to adapt the policies to to their conditions. So which is one of the problems with the whole Bloomberg approach, is that they're taking Western templates and trying to just dump them onto countries where these don't matter. To just give you a very small example, there's a point of sale ban, advertising ban, which is being proposed in India. In India, a cigarette vendor has a stool. Where is he going to hide that thing? He's going to, it's not a practical solution. And you would have understood that if you had tried to build the solution from ground up and not try to, just pick something up from the US or what has worked in other countries. So the Western nations, led by US, I believe, have a moral responsibility to help the developing world tackle this issue, because they have done things right and things have worked. I think one of the way I think WHO tries to present the problem, Western countries is fine, they have enforcement, these guys don't, and therefore it should be banned. But if you cannot enforce regulation, how are you going to enforce a ban? So I do not, is the life of someone who's living in a smoker in a developing world less important than the one, and this should not happen, because for me, this is discrimination.
Has the US played an inordinate role in developing the misinformation that's affecting the rest of the world?
Of course, and it has been funded, and of course, this has also happened in different parts of the world, but what happens in the US gets amplified a lot more, right? So we know that the direction that US takes, but also US has been curiously silent, just as the UK has been, on this issue at the FCTC level, and I think they should, ask themselves, can we in good faith let this happen?
Yeah, does the US really participate in FCTC and the WHO to the same extent that other countries do?
America is not even a member of the FCTC, right? It is one of the countries which has not signed the protocol, but it is one of the bigger funders of the WHO. So in that sense, it does exercise a lot of control. Now, what has happened is that the whole grand US retraction from the world, looking inwards, and the US left the WHO and also stepped back from UNESCO and all the other major UN bodies, and then they realized, okay, then that gives space for China to come in and influence policy, and we saw how the WHO responded to the pandemic in the initial days, right? It was completely China-led. That wouldn't have happened if US needs to play that leadership role, and it is important now than ever, because there is this whole breakdown of public trust with public health. If you're going to start saying from rooftops there's no safe level of drinking, suddenly, when countries have had for decades limits to how much a person can consume, and you suddenly, because you want to pick this up and make it so activist sounding without even being true, there's just one study I think that they're relying on, and then that that's where all this is coming from. So our public health has to be more humane, and I don't know why the one arm of governance which is concerned with humanity and humaneness has become so radical and misguided. They say that the tobacco industry has been creating these astroturf organizations, which is I'm not denying that's not true. And for long, they have tried to, help a consumer movement grow. But who would really defend trying to smoke and die from it? There are consumer smoker groups, and I have nothing against them. People have all the right to demand the rights they think are fair to them. But it still didn't have wider appeal. But now, there are people like me who know for sure that they have averted a certain part to death and want others to have that opportunity. So we are genuinely fighting for human rights, right to better health, right to autonomy, right to make choices, safer choices. But they have not adapted to that. So the tobacco control does not understand a person like me.
Let's look at, like, say, a campaign for tobacco-free kids in the United States, which is totally funded by Bloomberg. Why is that not an AstroTurf organization for tobacco control?
Not just that. So CTFK and the union are grant managers for for India. So they are the ones who then further give grants to Indian organizations. And some grants are as small as $10,000. Some grants are complete violation of the law. It's on their website for filing court cases, which is not permitted, lobbying to governments, lobbying to media channels. So, all this is, they're doing this and quite openly. And there seems to be, you can't touch us. There's nothing that you can do about it. We have created so much ill will among people that there's no sympathy for someone like you. So you don't even have a say. So it's just us trying to save our lives. Despite, and we have to fight them for it. And I find that is what shocked me the most when the ban came.
Do you think that tobacco control considers consumer advocate groups for THR to be useful idiots of the tobacco companies?
Yeah. So that's what. So when this research paper was published, us consumer organizations wrote our responses. They have been published, thankfully. And I think then Ruth Malone, who was the editor at the time, wrote a tweet saying that it's unfortunate that consumers have been co-opted and, sort of brainwashed by the tobacco company. But, if I'm going to live 20 years longer, I don't need a tobacco company to tell me that, I would take it. I don't need incentive. That's incentive enough for me. If I have good health, if I can, I'm not huffing and puffing climbing a step of stairs, then that works for me. And it should, others should have that opportunity. But it's not about smokers, really, and that's not the feeling we get. Because, in 2018 COP, so us consumers went there, we tried to speak to delegates, they would just not even, we are selling them cigarettes or something, and we are just trying to tell them that we are consumers. Then Tobacco Tactics page has our photograph there saying that we are trying to lobby. Of course, we're going to lobby, and we have the right to seek good health, ensure that, we don't fall ill. We can guard ourselves against possible consequences of tobacco use. We've seen it work for so many people. There are gums, but we know how effective they are. Not to say that they shouldn't be available, but people should have a bouquet of options to see what works for someone. Not everything works. There's no one solution.
Nobody, nowhere, I can think of, no regulator, nobody in public health would ever consider these to be consumer products. And the model might not be fitting because they just can't fathom it as a consumer product.
Yeah, because they haven't taken the effort to understand what it is and why it is so wonderfully being picked up all across the world. Despite regulations and so much negative media, 100 million users in a span of a decade, that's a public health win. It should be celebrated. 100 million people quit. But I don't see why, but if you picked up Indian newspaper of the last 3 months, you wouldn't think tobacco is killing 1.35 million people. You would think that vaping is the big problem, which kill no one, and it's by own government statistics used by only 0.02% people. So there's this complete, the priorities have gone completely wrong here.
I think across so many different aspects of people's lives, in the West, in India and Asia, there has been such an increase in the desire for control in so many aspects of life.
Sure.
And that I think that there is something about autocratic natures that they don't allow individuals to enjoy simple pleasures.
Sure, I totally take your point, and WHO is now coming up. There's no safe level of drinking. Now, that's not the way to communicate any idea to anyone, because what I need to know is that if I'm a moderate drinker, and if it's going to lead to is the reward or is the risk one which I'm willing to balance with the reward that I get from social drinking. So that is the way to communicate. You communicate, okay, if this happens, if you do this, and then that happens, rather than say there's no safe level of drinking. There's no safe level, there's no safe tobacco product. These are very paternalistic, control-minded, top-down kind of things to say. And I believe WHO needs to be reimagined, because it's become a system that's been gamed. China gets away with whatever it wants to do, even though it has a tobacco monopoly, which sells so many cigarettes. The Indian tobacco monopoly and Thailand, another country. So for these countries to show that we have banned and we are at the forefront of tobacco control when you are participants in selling cigarettes to the people, and then you get awards for it, because WHO also is not that concerned apparently that life will be saved. They just want to show that work is being done, and it's become increasingly private funded. So there have been papers on how can WHO become effective again, because the way they performed at the pandemic, it was just like a very tardy response, and yet the same guy gets reelected, unopposed. So something is obviously not right. There's some status quoism that has become so ingrained in that body that it's not actually doing anything effective.
We're here at the Global Forum on Nicotine. What's your expectations of moving the ball along at this event?
See, while there has, you have to balance it out. While the situation is getting worse in some countries, I think we are looking at a ban. I'll just tell you what's happening in Asia very quickly. Bangladesh may be looking at a ban, but Thailand may be moving in the other direction. Philippines has, Taiwan banned. So there's a lot of, it's still, it's also a COP year. So we can expect a lot of this stuff, a lot of these decisions, a lot of activism from our end also to happen. And I think the COP is, this is an important COP. A lot of key ideas are on the table, one of which is that they want to treat vaping as smoking. The vape is smoke, which it is not, and they know, and it's a very disingenuous argument, but they want it to be included in, the things that they fight. So, and that is quite dangerous, because then you're completely negating the idea of harm reduction.
What's insidious about that is we're talking about completely, totally maligning language. It's a simple thing. They can't get the changes they want to have happen, so they want to take what's already in place and just go, well, we're just going to define vapor as smoke.
Sure, and in all this, what I see is that they're trying to stay relevant. It's their fight for relevance, which they also understand. Because there is data showing that as vaping got more accepted in European nations, nicotine gums, patches, use of those, and visits to these centers dropped because people were quitting on their own. So why would they need to go through a program? And that's an existential threat. And Clive Bates does make that point very clearly, that if there is no harm, then what is tobacco control in the autocratic way that it exists today, loses the entire meaning of its existence. So this could be just a fight for relevance.
Well, I think I'd like to put it into a larger picture, because as you said earlier in the interview, it was a precautionary principle mechanism that they were able to utilize to create this control that they have over tobacco by saying that it's the harm that's being done to everybody else. Here's the proof, it's secondhand smoke. From that, they were able to remove individual liberty in the United States and Canada, throughout the West and everywhere else. Yeah. And so this mechanism is very important to autocrats, to totalitarian wannabes, and so the ability to change language, to redefine something, to be able to achieve control end. I think that these are very important steps for them to do to like create their control.
Sure. I mean, look at EVALI. CDC is known for like over 2 years now that nicotine had nothing to do with it, and yet they let that thing stay. And this whole this last World No Tobacco Day, there were more articles on vaping in India, against vaping in India, than they were about tobacco. And every one of them had EVALI in it. They're still being regurgitated when everyone knows it's not to do with nicotine vaping, but you're still attacking something which you got it wrong then, and it's upon you to correct it. And you know that scientists wrote to them and they still don't agree.
Well, I don't think the CDC got it wrong. I think they got exactly what they wanted.
Yeah, so that if in United States that kind of misinformation is accepted, I think there is also a sort of holier than thou. Like even if we lie to you, as long as we can get an outcome which we believe is noble, it's okay to lie to you. That should not be how public health is done.
Well, no, and look at the FDA too, just for one moment, if I may. The deeming regulation deems this piece of plastic right here to be a tobacco product.
Yeah.
This right here, just the plastic, is tobacco. Well, no, it's not tobacco. Do you deem a Bic lighter as tobacco? No, it's a lighter.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, I think overall they're just well over their skis.
And they've been allowed to get away with it for too long, and not without reason, because when there's so many people dying, then you want to do what you think the experts have told you.
Let me just because we're deep, who knows what I'm going to use here, but how is there so many people dying? Because in the United States of America, the same number of people have been dying of smoking for 30 years. The numbers never changed, even with all of this stuff that's gone on.
Like billions have been spent.
And our side, on the tobacco harm reduction side, we use that same number because that number is advantageous for us, right? So it's crazy, but we're all talking about how all these people are dying every year. It's the same number for 30 years.
And in third world countries, I mean, people, and maybe that, I don't know if that is one of the reasons why these numbers, while huge, are not driving the kind of action. The pandemic response, like 1/10 of the number of people died, but the response, and here, every year these people are dying, and there doesn't seem to be the sense of urgency or what I do see is resignation among these people that, okay, we tried everything, not working. Mm-hmm. So why not try something else? Why still, why are you doubling down on that same path?
Samrat, so, what's been the impact of that 2019 ban in the aftermath?
So the ban was, as I was telling you, rushed through Parliament when legislators didn't even know what these products are. Right after that, the legal vendors, right, the ones who were playing the big game, wanted to be entrepreneurs who really wanted to build a business, a green business, with this. They exited the market because they didn't want, to deal with the legality of it. They moved to other countries. Some went to Dubai, other countries that were opening up, Malaysia and Philippines. What happened was then the smugglers, the people who smuggle all kinds of stuff, they added e-cigarettes to their portfolio. For them, it's just another product that they're smuggling. It's like counterfeit cigarettes or watches or whatever is getting smuggled, is in iPhones or whatever that is. So this just became another product in their portfolio, and it exploded. You had like tons being caught, huge. So when you know from a seizure that big is the seizure, that's just like 0.1% of the market. Then it gives you a sense of how big the market is. I went to tier 2, tier 3 towns, almost like semi-villages, and you get vapes there. So what has happened now is that the opportunity to control, to do this right, what could have been a boon is now perhaps going to become a bane, because now, even if they're regulated, these products will never be able to compete with, these tax products will never be able to compete with cheap, illegal, untaxed products. So you've created a problem. You should have been the first to go to people and say, okay, these are e-cigarettes, this is, the risk and the benefit, and this is who it is for, and you could have informed and educated them. By trying to brush everything under the carpet, you just have taken control from these legal vendors and given it to the black market, who doesn't also care whether they sell to a minor or not. So a minor today in India has more access, easier access to these products than it had earlier, or than they had earlier. So now you have vapes being found in schools. Also, you know, when you see, perhaps if you see a kid smoking, you'll not be that shocked, but if you see him vaping, it's new. So there's also that false perception that this is, you know, everywhere, where those kids were also smoking if you ask them, or most of them.
Now, I would imagine that that illegal products that are coming in are mostly disposables.
So yes, so you know, earlier there was also sort of you know, you had to buy the mod and the tank and learn how to do coils, and so there was a learning curve. Also, it was expensive, so there was a natural cap. With disposables, also, you know, you can get genuine disposables, though you know, I mean, without a recycling program, I think disposables are not that good an idea. You know, before launching it, there has to be a recycling mechanism in place. Having said that, they can also they also have a huge advantage, because people could have otherwise not tried, you know, because now they can at least try if it works for them. So that barrier to you know, making that switch has come down. So it has its you know, pros, like especially in third world countries where people cannot, you know, buy expensive devices. So they have a benefit, but then there is also a problem. So it has to be dealt, balancing both these imperatives, that okay, we don't want cheap fake stuff to be available, but we also want a smoker to have easier access to something which is less harmful. There needs to be a push from a UK, US even, you know, despite all that is going on internally, it's not banned. You know, you still have access to these devices. You still have a lot of data showing that, you know, teen smoking has vanished, and and smoking also is in decline among adults. So those are all good things happening, and these countries do have a responsibility, in my view, to take up the issue at the WHO level, because they're also big funders. The rich countries should also stand up to WHO and say, listen, this is not right. Look at our countries. We have seen results. There has been accelerated decline in smoking rates, and it can be made to work.